I am really, my professional background is as a botanist. I worked for many years as a surveyor and doing inventories of rare plants and noxious plants. But my job currently is that I'm the coordinator for the Land Steward Program. So I have a pretty broad natural resources background. I've taught wildfire educational materials and workshops. And I'm also the president for our Siskiyou Chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. So native plants are very near and dear to my heart, as is firewise landscaping. So Marcy can start record. If you have any ideas for classes or instructors, please drop them into the chat and we will take note of that. You will get a PDF of this presentation. So there's a lot of information in this presentation. Don't worry about trying to capture it all. You'll get a PDF of the PowerPoint along with a link to the recording of the presentation tomorrow. Basically, what we are going to cover this evening is a little bit of an introduction to fire ecology in Southwest Oregon, a little bit about general concepts for the home ignition zone, really focused on plants. The home ignition zone as fire ecology, also, those are very big topics, but I just kind of want to thread us into thinking about native plants for this topic of firewise vegetation. So we're going to talk just a little bit about fire behavior, species characteristics, and my hope is that more than just lists, that you will kind of learn how to evaluate what makes good vegetation to have around your home. And then I will talk about why natives make a difference. And then we will go into a list of species to consider. And if we have time, we might go through a few anecdotes, local anecdotes. So before we get started with our content, I always like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge the first stewards. Wherever we are, we're on native lands. And where I'm in Ashland. And this is the traditional lands of the Tequilma, the Shasta, and the Letgawa native people. And these folks, like many people really throughout the world, have managed the land and the vegetation with fire for millennia. They did it to provide good plant foods as well as native plant resources for basketry and different things that they used for their lives. They did it to provide better access to animal resources as well. I recently read that anthropologists are now starting to call humans the pyrophilic primate. They're attributing our dependence on and use of fire as one of the key characteristics of our species, really in our evolution. So we're all very, fire has been and is important to us really globally and certainly locally. So there have been studies done by the Nature Conservancy, and Carrie Metlin in particular has really worked on this, looking at fire return intervals in the Rogue Valley and in the Ashland watershed. This is a slab of ponderosa pine from the Ashland watershed. And you can see when you do a tree cookie cut like this, you can see burn scars. A tree cookie is a slice through a slab of tree. So you can see the different burn scars, and using they can date those burn scars and they can see how frequently the fires return. So you can see that there are fires going along. And then in about 1902, they kind of stop. And then the next one is 1995. So looking at tree scars throughout our watershed, this is the Rogue River watershed, you can see different fire return intervals. So we, in Ashland, the fire return interval is about 11 years, plus or minus 14. Further towards Immigrant Creek, it's 6 years, plus or minus 8. I'm just kind of gathering a few examples. Big Butte Creek here, this is every 5 years, plus or minus 20. So that means that fire was returning in the landscape really frequently, often low intensity fires being used by native people to help manage their landscape and their resources. However, in 1910, the US started a policy of really aggressive fire suppression. And along with that, something that doesn't really get called out, but there was also a disuse of fire in the landscape. So up until 1910, Native Americans and European colonists who had come in and learned from the natives used these light fires to help manage the landscape. But in 1910, kind of for a number of reasons, that changed, and they really had a policy of stopping all fires as quickly as they could. And that's what happened. So now climate change is leading us is added into that and is leading us to our current situation, which is really captured in this next slide. So this is a map of Southwest Oregon large fires from 1960 to 2018. So these are the large fires from 1960 to 1979. This is from 1980 to 99. And this is from 2000 to 2018. So you can see that we are definitely in a trend, and this could cause a lot of despair, but I don't want you to think that way. What my hope is that we will all become fire adapted, that we'll embrace our inner pyrophile with knowledge and preparation and recognize that we live in a landscape that really needs fire, and we need to educate ourselves and learn what we can do to live within that landscape in the best way. So what can we do? We can learn. So here on the screen, you'll see a couple of really great websites. Our OSU has a really great fire program with many webinars and resources, publications. Also, another one that I have found incredibly useful is University of Nevada, Reno, Living with Fire. They have so many great publications. I've pulled a lot of things from them as well. So learning is one of the things we can do, and then preparing is another thing. And winter is a great time to prepare. And I'm really going to kind of gloss over a number of these things, but my hope is that you will attend Herb's class when we have that later on. But a number of things that you can do using resources that you'll find in these websites. You can create your evacuation plan. I cannot stress that enough. Please do that. You can do what you can to improve the conditions of your home ignition zone, which I will talk a little bit more about. This includes things like home hardening, what's going on with your fences, your decks, your mulches, your vegetation, the placement and maintenance of your vegetation, and the point that I am really going to focus on this evening, what species you're choosing and natives. That's what I'm going to focus on. Now, when they talk about firewise landscaping, they aren't necessarily saying plant natives, but that's the thrust of this class tonight. So these are a lot of topics, and there's a lot to all of those topics, and I hope that you will investigate them, but it's beyond the scope of this course pretty much. We are going to talk a little bit about how wildfire does threaten our home. So wildfire threatens homes in 3 significant ways. So I'd like you to take just a minute and think about which of these 3 ways you think causes most home loss. So on the top, you have a picture of embers. So the trees are burning and embers are blowing towards the house. Another way that wildfire threatens homes is through radiant heat. So that's just the fire next to the building, but not touching it. So it's radiating and it's heating up the surfaces. And then the third is contact by flames. So a wall of fire burning through vegetation and flames licking on the side of the house. So a lot of people think that it's going to be those flames that really burn your house down. But what we have found with fire science is that really most houses burn due to embers more than any other cause. And very often it's because embers get into the house itself. And again, those are concepts that we're not going to talk about too much. But knowing that the embers are really important and the radiant heat is also important. And I did want to take just a moment. I know that we have had some significant fires in our area, and it could be triggering for folks. There have been a lot of people that were affected by fires, my own family included. My husband's house burned down in Talent with the Almeda fire. So if we're talking about fire and it's upsetting to you, please do take a minute and step away if you need to, and there will be a recording and you can watch it later if you feel like you need to. So embers are an important thing. Embers and radiant heat. So one of the things that I talked about in the introduction, or in kind of the flyer for this program, was thinking about plants as allies and how plants can actually help us. So the idea is fighting fire with plants. Yes, you can. They can be allies in fire. So this is an image from Australia where they're thinking about this a lot. They also have a really fire adapted landscape. So if you have really moisture rich species in your home ignition zone, the area around your house, they can protect your home, help to protect your home from radiant heat from nearby fire, and they can actually screen embers out. So often there's a lot of wind and it's really an ember storm. They're being blown, and green and living and moist vegetation can absorb many of those embers without igniting and can make it so that there aren't as many embers that are trying to get into and around your house. So those are some of the ways that plants can help you. So we're going to talk about managing our personal landscape in this class, that near-in landscape in the event of a wildfire. We talk about that as the home ignition zone. So the home ignition zone is the area generally considered to be about from the home to about 100 and sometimes 200, depending on the context, if there's a slope or not, feet out. And it's the area where the conditions within that zone are going to impact the likelihood of the house igniting. So that's why it's called the home ignition zone. This is a resource that you'll be able to get out of the PowerPoint if you want. This is from our Land Steward program, actually. It's got best practices about the home ignition zone, what you can do, and then checklists at the back about how you can take care of that and get things in better shape to resist fire. Now, when you're in an urban setting, like I am, or like many of the folks were in Paradise or in the Almeda fire that happened, what you are looking at is something like this. So you might say the home ignition zone is up to 100 feet out, but in my house, for example, I have houses within 20 feet of my house on 3 sides. So in my house, we are all part of each other's home ignition zone. So there's a lot, a house is a very big pile of really dry, wonderful, flammable fuel there isn't much that can be done about that, but you can kind of take steps around your personal landscape. But it's something to keep in mind, to work with your neighbors, and also to just kind of recognize that it is one of the factors of urban living. So home ignition zone guidelines vary a bit. This is from a publication from the University of Nevada. And you can see that they have this first zone being within 3 feet of the house. I'm just going to kind of gloss over this a little bit, but they're saying, put your evergreens out 30 feet. So these are their recommendations. This is the recommendation from Ashland. This is from a publication that Ashland has on their website, Ashland, Oregon. So they're talking about an urban home ignition zone and what you can do. And this is another publication here, Keeping Your Home and Property Safe from Wildfire. So in the urban context, the first zone, which is sometimes called 1A or zone 0, or the immediate zone, or the non-combustible zone, the ember-resistant zone. So it can be given lots of different names depending on what you're looking at, but it's within about 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 feet from your house. And what they're currently recommending now for that area most close to your house is rock mulches or hard pavers. Now, we know that not everyone has that. I don't have that at my house. They also recommend maybe succulents or low irrigated herbaceous plants. So flowers, annual flowers are often a good thing, but things that are really unlikely to burn. When embers get blown around, they often gather in the corners of houses and up against the foundation. And if there's burnable material there, that can often be a weakness in a house. So zone 1 is from 5 feet out to 30 feet, and that is the intermediate zone. So this they describe as wanting it to be lean, clean, and green. So you want low density of vegetation, and you want it well maintained and pruned, well watered. A watered landscape doesn't conserve water, but it does conserve a moist landscape that won't burn very easily. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Basically, that's the residential landscape very often, is just up to those 30 feet. The home ignition zone, as we talked about, goes out to 100 or maybe 200 feet, and that's considered the outer defensible space. It often, in a more wildland setting, has more natural vegetation, and you're recommended to reduce your fuels, to thin out your brush, and limb up your trees, which you also want to do in zone number 1. But in our case, in an urban context, your neighbor's house is within that, and you are within their zone 2 as well. So the most impact in an urban setting, what you can have is that 0 to 30 feet, perhaps. So, and again, I'm not going to go too much into the details about limbing up to 10 feet and all those other things. What I really want to focus on is the species when I get there. But you can find resources to evaluate your vegetation. So what we want to talk about is the characteristics of more fire-resistant plants. And my hope is, again, that you'll learn to kind of evaluate those plants. So I do want to have a little disclaimer, and we can talk about fire-resistant plants, but everything burns, really. All plants certainly will burn if they're given the right conditions. But one of the things that I really noticed after the Almeda fire, I started using the word fire-reluctant plants. And this is a quote from the University of Nevada, Reno, that some plants are harder to ignite. They generate less heat when burning, and they produce shorter flames than other plants. So they can actually, these are the ones that can be an ally for you in a fire, and they will be less of a threat for your fire in a fire. So the characteristics of more fire-resistant plants, key is that they have leaves with higher moisture content. A number of other features are that they are drought resistant or drought tolerant. And this is one way that our native plants come in, and I will talk about that a little bit more. But if a plant needs less water to maintain the moisture that it has, then it will maintain that moisture and be more fire resistant. Whereas if you have, for example, when I first bought my house, I planted a hydrangea, but I didn't want to water it enough because I felt like it was taking too much water. So it gets really dry and brittle, and then it's not a moisture-rich plant that would help my house. So native plants are drought resistant, and they are a better choice. Lower growing habitat is generally a better feature for fire-resistant plants. They have little buildup of dead material. They don't have dead twigs and dead leaves, lots of dead material that's inside, and I've got some pictures that will demonstrate that. They lack flammable chemicals, so they're not strong smelling very often. These volatile oils, things like lavender, so if you can smell, when you crush your plant, if it gives off a really strong smell, then often that's an indication of having volatile oils. Something that we often don't know one way or the other unless we look it up is fire-resistant plants will often have a high soap. They'll have saponins or mineral content like salts in the vegetation, and that will actually help be a depressant for fire. And then the cultural activities can impact them. So they're well watered according to their needs. They're pruned. The dead material is taken out. They're properly placed and properly spaced. So there are some plants that you definitely want to avoid, and many towns and areas have lists that will outline these for you. But you might really, I recommend that you avoid planting and consider removing plants that have the following characteristics. So there are some pictures here on the right, but plants that accumulate dry, dead branches or leaves. So junipers are some of these that are really characteristic this way. If you trim this hedge, you see that inside it's very dense and full of dead old leaves and stems. There are a number of species that are like that. Leland cypress. In my yard, when I bought my house, I had 3 of the really bad ones. I had Leland cypress, arborvitae, which is this one, and I also had Italian cypress, which is that long, tall, narrow one. When I took out my Italian cypress, my neighbor said, who is a fire professional, he said that they really go off like Roman candles, and he was very glad that I had taken them out. So you can imagine when trees like this burn, they really throw lots of sparks. So it makes them a risk not only for your landscape, but your neighbor's landscape as well. So they accumulate dry, dead branches or leaves. They have volatile oils or resins, and they often smell strong. They're drought stressed. So even a plant that might not be otherwise a risk, if it's drought stressed, then that can make it more combustible. Often evergreens are not a good choice, but that's not always true. So those are some of the characteristics you want to look for. So let's talk a little bit about native plants. So we're going to talk about native plants that have those good characteristics of being fire resistant, but we're also going to talk about here how native plants support a resilient landscape. So not just being fire-wise, they're also wildlife-wise. So they support wildlife habitat. Native plants are the best way to support wildlife wildlife, if you care about wildlife. So people talk a lot about pollinators, and that you can think of as butterflies and bees that are coming and nectaring on plants, but they're also host plants for native insects that breed and lay their larvae. And native birds eat those insects, or arthropods if they're not insects. So they don't just eat berries and seeds. They actually, it's really important that they have bugs to feed their young. Without bugs, most, even birds that do eat lots of berries and seeds, eat bugs and feed bugs to their young when they're developing. So native plants are key for that. Another factor, and this is kind of works against what we think of for firewise landscaping and keeping that lean, clean, and green landscape. So dead stems and leaves provide habitat for many insects. So you might have heard the phrase "leave the leaves" in the fall, so that because many insects will drop off of the plants and down into the leaves, and they will overwinter in leaves. They'll eat the leaves, or they'll pupate in the leaves. So if you clean up all the leaves in the fall, then you've removed habitat for those insects. If you want to support the wildlife in that way, you can consider cleaning in the late spring before the fire season, if you want to leave some of the plants and some of the dead stems for the insects to breed in. So native plants support wildlife habitat. They also conserve water. Our natives, many, really most, and even some of our riparian or wetland species that you'd think of in a moist environment, are better adapted to conserve water. They're prepared for our seasonally dry weather. They stay moister and less fire resistant with less irrigation. So they're a really good choice. The moisture content in the vegetation can depress the intensity of the fire, as we talked about. And then, of course, native trees shade and cool your home in the urban landscape. So non-native trees can also do that, but I'm talking about natives here. So these are all benefits of having native plants in your landscape. So we're going to move on to selecting plants. And I wanted to just say a little bit about lists. And that is that it is difficult for scientists to really analyze specific plants. Often they'll do it by listing the different characteristics of the plants. But as we talked about, it depends a lot about the maintenance of the plant and the placement of the plant. So just straight up lists aren't necessarily always the way to go. And you'll see they vary when you start looking at lists. They vary quite a bit. I did want to recommend this resource from OSU. This is Fire Resistant Plants for Home Landscapes. This doesn't only it contains some natives, but also non-natives. It's a really good resource, and they are working on updating it now, and here's the link for it. But I'm just going to talk about natives in this presentation mostly. So I've put together a bunch of slides that we're going to move into next. I'm going to take a little drink of water. And the resources that I've used to create these slides, these are the links, and you'll be able to follow up on these if you want. The range maps are from the Oregon Flora Project, which is a super site and has lots of resources. The kind of plant characteristics are from a site called CalScape, which is from the California Native Plant Society, and I'll indicate what that is. I've used a lot of iNaturalist images that have community commons images, so they allow people to use the sites without accreditation. And then another really good resource is this Fire Resistance of Plants Master Database and Placement of Species within the Fire Landscape Zones. And this comes out of Southern Idaho. What they did was they evaluated really quite a few species, including native species, for Idaho, but many of them are native for us as well. And they looked at the moisture content of the vegetation, the size of the plants, the soap or mineral content, and then the content of volatile oils and resins. And they scored the species. And so the higher the score, counterintuitively, the more fire resistant it is. And the lower the score, the less fire resistant. So they say to be within that 30-foot zone, you would need a score of 8. Beyond that, 7, 6, 5 into zone 2, that's up to 60 feet. This is the way they've worked it. And then further out is into that 100-foot zone. So I just wanted to pause and see if there are any questions about that material that I've covered so far before I move into the species. Marcy, you want to, or I can actually look here. Okay. Are we recording?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, we're recording. Michael is asking if in Ashland's home ignition zone planting plan, do they integrate a certain tree canopy percentage that is optimal? I haven't seen that, but it's possible that they do. There was a recent study that came out looking at the Paradise Fire that talked about the tree canopy, and I think that it was if it was over 50%, they had a higher risk of burning. I can include a link to that in the resources that I give you afterwards. I haven't seen that in Ashland's material, but it's possible.
And Rachel, Christie asked, wouldn't a drought tolerant plant be more dry and flammable since they aren't being watered very much? Yeah,
Christie. So I will kind of the idea, I'll save that. And as I talk about some of these species, I'll bring that up. I'll get to that. Okay, so we're going to move on here and I will remember to talk about that. So this is I just wanted to kind of show you, this is from Calscape. So this is for Lewis's mock orange. This site is really great. I've just got little clips in the slides that are coming up, but it talks about the plant description, says it's a plant, a shrub, the size. It talks about how fast they grow and whether or not they're deciduous, other characteristics. And then it talks about the wildlife, this is the best site that I have found for kind of showing what wildlife is supported by the species. Then there's also kind of landscape information, what sun, shade, moisture. This is one of the key things I've called out in the slides that follow, how much irrigation, and then nurseries, but this is for California. So that's a little prompt for that site. Calscape is a great resource. So now we're going to talk about species, and I'm going to kind of go from lower up to bigger species. So as we go along, if you have questions about these individual species, feel free to drop them in. And Marcy, go ahead and you can interrupt me if it's relevant to the species that we're talking about. So we talked about low plants. This wild strawberries get a score of 8. So they are okay. They really have a good fire resistance score according to that, to Idaho's master database. So these are my raspberries. This is actually a picture from my yard. So you can see that it's just full of wild raspberries underneath. These are all Fragaria vesca, which is one that you would find in our understory in the forest quite often, but they do okay in the sun as well. And they really fill in. One of the thoughts that I'm coming to in my own landscape is to really spread these little, very willing wild strawberries, which are easy to get started. Mine actually came in when I just brought in a little bit of mulch from the forest, and now they're spreading everywhere. And I think that this is a good, they're remarkably, strangely drought tolerant. So they don't need a lot of moisture. They maintain their moisture well. They don't dry out. If you don't water them, they don't rapidly dry out and then become more flammable. So this is near to my house, so they're pretty well watered. But even when I don't water them a lot, they don't need super frequent water. So I'm thinking that this is a good mulch replacement, a good way to keep my soil covered. This is one species that's good for that. You can see they have a wide distribution. They're quick growing, and they are also a really great wildlife host. So you can see in this site, I know that this is a little bit small, but they are a host to 1 confirmed butterfly and moth species and for 41 likely. So that means that strawberries in other areas have been found to host many species. And so this specific one, they don't know all of them, but it's likely a host for many plants. Strawberries are a great understory species to include in your landscape. Another cool one, which CalScape didn't have a lot of information on the wildlife that it supports, but is wild ginger. So this is a shade plant. So it's good for north sides and north and east sides or underneath trees. It doesn't grow as fast as something like English ivy, which is really invasive and you want to avoid, but it will really fill in areas. And it's listed here as moderate to high in the moisture, needing water once a week. But what I find in my landscape is that they're kind of a low water species. Again, they're not something that needs water all the time. They are deer resistant. I have these in the front of my yard, and they're an interesting plant. Underneath these charming heart-shaped leaves, they have a really beautiful kind of maroon colored flower that is an early spring flower, and they're pollinated by gnats and flies. It kind of is what we call a carrion flower. So it doesn't have a flowery smell. It has kind of a carrion smell. So the gnats and flies pollinate it, and then the seeds are spread by ants. So it's supporting wildlife in your understory. And I love it. And this is one that I'm planting around in my shady spots. California poppy is a really good one and has quite a wide distribution. It's quick growing. It likes full sun to part shade, so it's very tolerant of a lot of conditions. And you can see down here, it's not a super wildlife supporter, but it does support, it says 5 lepidopteras, so those are butterflies and moths, and 2 likely. But it gets a score of 10, so it's very fire resistant. Silver lupin and lupins in general get a good score. So they are scored as 10. But silver lupin is one of my favorites, but we have a lot of species. It's a perennial lupin. It's very low moisture needs. It's very attractive to bees. And this is just for this species, its distribution here, but we have many lupins. Lupins are nice ones to plant. And so this is up to 49 species of moths and butterflies and very attractive to bees. Oh, I didn't get more details in here, but nettle leaf, there were so many, I kind of ran out of time for all the species I wanted to put in here. But nettle leaf horse mint is another really wonderful one. Pollinators just love this plant. And I'm sorry, I didn't get the other information in there, but I did get the distribution and the picture so that you can find it. And it's just covered with bees in the summertime, bees and butterflies. Pennsylvania, here we go.
Before we move on, Christina just made the comment that poppies provide important pollen source for bumblebees in the fall.
Great, good. Yes, thank you.
And while we're in the
chat, there's Christina, great. Yes.
Sharice asked you to please define what makes a species native in Southern Oregon.
Right. Okay, good. Right. Native is one of those concepts. Sometimes people will say, they'll say it's native, but what they mean is native is to North America. So, for example, a red maple, like I have in my front yard, is native to the eastern United States. So that's native to North America, but it's not locally native to Southwest Oregon. It may be that it's got some crossover in terms of being a host for insect species, but it may not. Or you might have something like the Norway maple, which is actually invasive. So that's not native. That's another kind of maple and not in North America. So the question of native is a good one. And it all depends on how you're defining it. You might define it as the Pacific Northwest, but I am really, my familiarity is really with Southwest Oregon in terms of being sure of what's in our woods and our forests around here. And this is why I'm including this map from the Oregon Flora Project right here, because this shows very clearly what the range is in terms of Oregon. If you go to the Oregon Flora Project and you click on the maps, when you look up a species, it will zoom out to the whole country and show where it is. And many of our species have a further distribution than just Oregon. But you can see wherever there are red dots, this is Jackson County down here, so you can see where things are native. And I think that clarifies it. So native is in the eye of the beholder. We're all native to Earth. Okay, orange honeysuckle, and also hairy honeysuckle, which is Lonicera hispidula. So these are vining plants. They don't get really dense like what's the one I'm thinking of? Like wisteria, for example, which you really have to aggressively prune all the time. These plants don't get, they're not as hard to maintain in a firewise state. So they'll vine up to 10 feet. This one is orange honeysuckle. They are pretty low moisture needing, like watering once a month, but you would want to think about your placement. So if it's a vining plant, you'd want to not have it right up next to your house, ideally. So you can see that in terms of butterflies and moths, it's 14 likely. Hummingbirds, I have one of these in my yard, and hummingbirds just adore it. And birds will eat the fruits as well. Douglas spirea is one of our riparian species. So we'd find these on the edge of moister areas. And so this is kind of gets to, and I forget who asked that question. Let's see, Christy. So what I have noticed, back, sorry about that. Doink. What I have noticed, so in Southwest Oregon, we typically don't get much rain at all in the summertime, and many in our natural conditions, many of our streams and even our what might be ponds or springs are ephemeral and will kind of disappear in the summer. We've changed the habitat quite a bit, so things are different. But so oftentimes spireas like this Douglas spirea are growing in an area which might be inundated with the spring snow melt, and then it'll be moist for a while, but then it will look pretty dry, and they'll still be all right in that condition. So that's what I've seen with a number of our riparian species. I have an issue in my front yard with it. I'm kind of in a little what was a riparian area before it was paved over and made into a town. And I have found that our native riparian species, this being one of them, really do really well here, even though it dries out. I water my yard a little bit to keep my trees alive, and these do okay with a low level of water, even though they're a riparian species. So that's what I mean about that being drought tolerant. Even though this is a species that likes to be around water, it's used to less water than maybe a species from, say, Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, where I grew up. So this one likes part shade to full sun. It's really pretty, quite a lovely kind of pyramidal flower inflorescence there. It says it's listed moisture as moderate to high, but then just kind of put in that description that I just gave to it. It's really tolerant of many growing conditions. One of the things about it is that it spreads, it's rhizomatous, so it's really great for hedgerows. So that's not necessarily an urban landscape, but it does take some maintenance to contain it and not have it become a really big, it can spread out into your yard. And I think for that reason, sometimes people aren't as in favor of it. Let's see. So you can see, though, it's a good supporter of wildlife with 33 likely moths and butterflies. I definitely see lots of moths and butterflies on them.
Someone is asking whether it's deer resistant.
No, it is not. I haven't really found anything. I have a pretty heavy deer grazing pressure in my yard, and so I have a fence around these. I'm hoping that eventually there will be enough volume that it will be able to take the deer, but I just had to put a little fence to contain it. I think, sometimes the natives are listed as deer resistant, but it kind of depends on where you are. And I really have a team of deer that just patrol daily, probably more than, morning and evening in our neighborhood. I don't know what it's like where you are. So Lewis's mock orange is another one that's like that. I often in wildlands would see this growing, near ephemeral rocky springs, and then it would be dry all summer long, but it still is doing fine there. And that's what it does in my yard. It does get some water in my yard, but it maintains its vegetation. It's able to maintain the moisture in its leaves with a low level of watering in my yard. So part shade or full sun, they have these wonderful, really pretty big white flowers, again, tolerant of many growing conditions and widespread as well. not according to CalScape, not a huge, not a really big diversity of species, but it's a delight to have in your yard. Okay, I put this one in. Even though the Jepson manual says it's difficult to grow and it's not necessarily, it's only got one species listed, just because I think it's a neat plant and it would be neat if people experimented with growing it a little bit. I'm not sure how that might happen, but maybe there are some plant propagators in our group. So this is an understory shrub species, and it's got these lovely shiny leaves, Oregon boxwood, and I think that it would be a nice one if we could figure out how to cultivate it. It definitely is drought resistant. It lives in low water conditions, understory shrub. That was just my own plug. Okay, silk tassel is another one. So a lot of times what you see is Garrya elliptica, which is a coastal species, really limited to the coast, but people often plant it. I think it's considered to be a little bit more showy, which is perhaps a moment to talk about showiness and native plants. I've had people actually tell me, I don't want native plants in my yard because they're ugly. And I think that it's maybe like an acquired taste. I think that the subtlety of many native species personally becomes something that I really delight in. And since they're supporting this wildlife diversity, that gives an extra richness to them. So our local one, the one that you would typically find in Southwest Oregon, is the Gary silk tassel. And you can see it has these dangling inflorescences. There are male and female plants. It gets, now we're moving into the shrub category, as you can see. It gets up to about 10 to 13 feet. It likes shade or part shade, but it's good in low moisture conditions. And I didn't find, there's no score. Not everything has a score because not everything is in that Idaho list, but some are from other lists where they're recommended. So our snowberries, common snowberry and creeping snowberry, are excellent choices. And these are an example of plants that have a high soap content in their vegetation. So that's like a fire retardant within the vegetation itself. So it's not something you would necessarily know without evaluating that vegetation. But this is, you can see the distribution of common snowberry and creeping snowberry. Creeping snowberry is a lower growing. Common snowberry can get up to 6 feet. And the creeping snowberry is often more along the ground. So kind of depending on what your needs are. It can be in full sun to part shade, depending on the conditions. The moisture can be low to high. It really tolerates a lot of conditions that way. And as I said, it has a high soap content. And it's, let's see, a pretty good wildlife supporter, with 9 likely in the Lepidoptera, which are moths and butterflies.
Rachel?
Yes.
My husband is asking about snowberry because we bought some at Plant Oregon, and they cautioned us that the high soap content makes it flammable and therefore should not be planted near the house.
Wow.
You agree with that?
That's not what I've read. I've read that high soap content actually makes it less flammable.
Oh,
yeah, that's that information from out of that Idaho book. Yes, soap or and minerals. Yeah, you guys can research in the links that I'm giving here.
Thank you.
Let's see. So blue elderberry. This is one that they say is easy to grow, but I have planted it twice in my yard and not had it take, and I'm not sure why, but it's supposed to be easy. It's another one that has a high soap content in it. This is one, so again, my hope is that you will become educated and savvy about the conditions of your plant. Just because you plant a plant that's meant to be fire resistant, some of them take maintenance, and this is one of them. These can develop kind of dead material or leggy material, so it's good to prune them out. But they are good for wildlife. The birds adore the berries. You can eat the berries also if you cook them, generally, because they do have some toxins as well. But they get fairly big, 20 to 30 feet, and they don't take a lot of moisture also. And again, you can see the distribution, pretty broadly distributed species. Okay, the cherries. So I know in our group here, I know we've got some fans of Doug Tallamy, who wrote Bringing Nature Home, and goes into the deep end of how native plants support wildlife by supporting insects, and the insects which kind of feed the birds and other wildlife. So he talks about 3 really key species to plant, or 2 at any rate. One is the oak, which I'm going to get to later. And he says that cherry species, native cherry species, are really great wildlife supporters. And you can see that's really borne out here. I have 2 examples in this talk. One is bitter cherry. So these are some pictures to show you. It's kind of the smaller, generally smaller species, pretty broad distribution, but you can see it's got 156 likely moths and butterflies that use it, as well as birds, bees, caterpillars. So this is a great one for supporting wildlife. And remember that supporting wildlife is partly having insects eat that plant, so not necessarily making it look spectacular. Chokecherry is another one. So this is Prunus virginiana, and this is a really broadly distributed species. So this distribution map shows you, if you click on one of those Oregon flora maps, it zooms out into the whole United States. So now we're looking, this is Washington up here, and this is the Intermountain West over here. So chokecherry has a really wide distribution. And again, it's another one, let's see, that really supports a lot of insect species, 122 likely. So can take sun or shade, doesn't need very much moisture. I think that this species could be a good one for vision barriers. It tends to really grow in. So where people plant those laurel bushes in some conditions, chokecherry might be a good thing to substitute as a native species. Willows. Sometimes I get asked about willows. We have, I know, with our recent Almeda fire, the fire went down the riparian area, and there were lots of willows in there, and people are concerned about willows carrying fire. And this is from that Idaho document. So this is Scowler's willow, which is our upland willow. So if you find a native willow that's kind of away from water, it's probably a Scowler's willow. They're really beautiful. They have lovely fall colors. And you can see the score they give it is a 5. So that's not something you'd want in that 1 to 30 feet of your house, according to their recommendations. But willows are tremendous wildlife supporters. They're really important, really early pollination plants, pollen sources for early season insects. They provide great habitat for wildlife. So if you have a condition where you can have willows, they're a really wonderful one. So with the Scowler's willow, they can take low to high. So again, as I said, if you find a willow away from water, it's probably Scowler's. Sun or shade, they can get from 20 to 50 feet. Red flowering currant. This is one that I have in my yard and love. It's one of those really showy native ones. So you can see the distribution here. They get from 6 to maybe 13 feet. Sun or part shade. They can take pretty low moisture, pretty low watering, and still, as we said, maintaining their kind of hydrated leaves, even though you're not watering them a lot. And they're a reasonable wildlife supporter here, 85 likely species. And the hummingbirds love the flowers. Douglas hawthorn is our native hawthorn. They get up to about 15 feet. I think they can get taller than that. But they can take full sun or part shade, and they list it here as moderate to high moisture. And I don't have personal experience with that I could really say, but I bet it's similar to like the mock orange, and I bet that they do okay with kind of low watering in the summer. And a pretty good wildlife supporter with 36 likely. But you want to watch out for invasive common hawthorn. Sometimes people, if you see You can see these kind of volunteering in the landscape, and those are ones that you wouldn't want to necessarily encourage. So now we're moving into some trees. And again, I'm kind of surprised that people don't plant big leaf maple. I'm trying to get one growing in my yard, but I think a lot of times people are drawn to what is exotic and unusual and different from the landscape that they live in. Actually, I can say that for myself as well, that it's kind of a learning process to think of the native plants as something that you would want in your yard. But I'm surprised at how infrequently I see big leaf maple. So this is a big tree up to 100 feet tall, can take part shade to full sun, moisture moderate to high, but they occur on our dry north slopes in forested areas where they wouldn't get any water all summer long. So this is something you might consider instead of a red maple. So they don't turn red, they turn kind of gold. You see them everywhere in the landscape, but they support lots of moss. Whoops, they can be, think of them as an ember screen for your house. So this shows 85 likely species. Rocky Mountain maple is a smaller maple tree, and this you see generally more in the mountain at higher elevations, and I'm not positive how it would do like in our valley bottoms, but it could be worth a try, and it might depend on where you live. They have smaller leaves, not as big of a tree. And again, a pretty good wildlife species, up to 72 species. So quaking aspen is another one that is a tree that is actually in decline in a lot of parts in the West. So there are a number of reasons to have it. Can get up to 80 feet tall, sun or part shade, moisture moderate to high. In my yard, it does really well. They tend to be in moister areas in a native environment, but it's doing all right in my yard with not, it does better than my red maple with the amount of water that I give in my yard. And this is an example of, I have one of these outside my work window, and just a day or two ago, I was looking at it and it was just covered with birds. And this is an example of how native species support native wildlife. And there were chickadees and flickers and titmice going all around on the bark. And it looked like there was nothing happening to me. So I went out with a hand lens and I looked closely at the bark, which it didn't have bugs all over it that I could see. It didn't look like there were, caterpillars or anything that was there to eat. But when I looked with my hand lens at all the little crevices, it was just covered with little mites and flies. And I don't mean like infested. I just mean they were living there in all the little crevices. I read about a study recently of chickadees, and it showed that in the wintertime, when you wouldn't think of there being any insects, and this was in the Midwest, that their crops were 50% full of bugs. So they're finding bugs in all the barks of these trees. And the aspen is one of those ones that kind of demonstrated that to me. So 98 confirmed species that it's hosting and 40 likely. So then kind of to the queen of oaks, our Oregon white oak, Quercus garryana, can be a really big tree, likes full sun, but can take, I think of it as really wanting full sun, but it can take a little bit of shade, according to what I read. Does well with low moisture. In fact, I've heard that if you suddenly start irrigating one, they won't like it. But I've also heard that if they grow up in a yard that's irrigated, they'll be okay. So the thing about I don't have it circled here, but 38 confirmed species on the white oak and 138 likely. So lots of species. The black oak is host to 178 likely species. So oak trees are a really great one. This is black oak range. It goes down into California. That's why they call it the California black oak. And this is our Oregon white oak, which goes north into British Columbia. So oak is a wonderful one to plant no matter where you are. Oak species support lots of wildlife, and they're in decline in general. So this is a picture of Willamette Valley oak habitat. So this is in 1938, the distribution of oaks, and this is in 2007. and this is in 2013. So in the Willamette Valley, they've lost over 90% of their oak habitat. So, and many of the species that go along with them, like the western gray squirrel, a lot of bird species, as that habitat is lost. And the oaks tend to occur in the valley bottoms where we tend to develop and have our agriculture. So it's always a reason to kind of keep your oaks. Someone pointed out to me recently that housing developments are often named for what they replace, like Oak Hill or Quail Run, for example. So we're often replacing our wild habitat in the easy living lands of the lower valley bottom. So this is our habitat. We are fortunate in Jackson County and in Southwest Oregon to have a real richness of oaks, but I wanted to put this side by side with what's gone on in the Willamette Valley because our populations are growing and our development is growing, and it would not be hard at all for our oak habitat to go the direction of the Willamette Valley oak habitat. So love your oaks and keep them. Okay, so now I'm kind of moving into summary mode on the species. So native deciduous trees that are considered to be firewise are the Oregon white oak, the California black oak, white alder. White alder is better in drought and heat. It tends to be the one that you find along our riparian areas down in Southwest Oregon. But you can find red alder in kind of cooler watersheds in our area. And as you go north, you find red alder in the forest, but white alder is a better choice for where we are. In the Almeda fire, I saw the white alder really kind of resisting ignition. So they were killed and they were wilted, but they didn't flame the way a Leland cypress, was left. A lot of them had their leaves that were just kind of desiccated on the tree. Big leaf maple, quaking aspen. Remember that trees can function as an ember screen. Conifers are not generally recommended. Only larches, which aren't native to our area, they're a deciduous conifer. And so conifers are a discussion, I think, but they're not generally recommended. So if you're looking to find native plant materials, so there are many more native plants, especially lots of native flowers, lots of things that would be good in the zones that are right close to your house. So I hope that you'll evaluate them and select them as you can as you're going forward. I just picked a handful of things that I thought might be interesting to people. If you are looking if you're from somewhere other than Southern Oregon, check your local native plant societies for lists of places that provide native plant materials, whether they're native nurseries. For example, that Calscape, if you were in California, you can click on that and they'll list them. Sometimes they're up to date, sometimes they're not, but lists are available. So our Siskiyou Chapter Native Plant Society of Oregon, we put together a list of plant resources, and you can find that at this link, but a few that I can see and will read are Althouse Nursery in Rogue River, Forest Farm at Pacifica, Goodwin Creek Gardens, Jackson County Master Gardener Association. So some of these organizations, they provide starts. Some places you can get seeds. Klamath Siskiyou Native Seeds, they do a great job of collecting native seeds and that you can plant yourself in the fall or winter is often the best time for planting native seeds. They need a cool and wet stratification usually. Plant Oregon and the Rogue Native Plant Partnership is another one, and there's another page of resources that I didn't capture in my screenshot here, but this is available on a Google Drive document that you can get through that link. I also wanted to give a shout out to our Jackson County Soil and Water Conservation District. They, at this link, if you Google them and explore their website, they're a trove of information and resources for folks that are living in Southwest Oregon. So they have plant lists, all kinds of plant lists, deer resistant plants, sun needs plant lists, and this is their fire resistant plant list. So it has some of the species that I've listed here and others that I haven't necessarily talked about. Dawn redwood. Someone's asking me about dawn redwood. I'll get to that in a second, I think. Okay. I just wanted to give a word or two about the combustibility of landscape mulches. So what we saw in the, or a lot of us saw in our local Almeda fire, that the bark mulches really burned like crazy. And this is a great document, again, from the University of Nevada, Reno, that talks about the combustibility of landscape mulches. What I'm seeing people recommend is pebbles or stones in that 0 to 5 foot or 0 to 3, 0 to 5 is really what they're recommending locally for that kind of non-flammable zone around your house. You know, it's kind of a balance. It's kind of a balancing act. And as I mentioned, you know, it's really not good to leave your soil bare, and we all want to conserve water. I'm experimenting with wild strawberries. But this document is a place that you can explore about mulches. And so in summary, I hope that you will, when you're thinking about plants to bring into your yard, think about natives. And if you want to evaluate them in terms of being firewise, things to consider. And this is nicely summarized again from the University of Nevada, Reno. When bringing a fire-resistant framework to plant selection, please consider, does the plant contain a lot of waxes, oils, or resins? That's going to make it more flammable. What is the leaf moisture content? Is it a moist-leaved plant? Does the plant have an open growth structure, or is it dense like that picture of the juniper with lots of dead material in there? How fast does the plant grow? How tall will the plant grow? You know, and I think that's like, if it's near your house and it's tall and it's something that will ignite, it's going to throw more sparks. And then does the plant shed bark? I didn't really talk about that, but some plants shed barks or lots of needles. Those materials can be a fire hazard if they build up. And this key point at the bottom, that pruning, maintenance, and cleanup can have a greater impact on whether a plant ignites than what type of plant it is. So even some things that might be considered to be flammable, maybe something like native buckwheats, if they are properly spaced and properly pruned, then it could still be something that's supporting wildlife in your yard, and not increasing your fire risk if it's properly maintained. So that is the end of that part. Do we have some more questions? And I can kind of go, I think I can maybe, I'll let you read them, Marcy, because I'm not sure how far to go back here, but I can see some of them.
Christy asked, just as a general question, when native plants are left to be more drought tolerant and not irrigated in the summer, are they still more fire resistant than other plants?
Yeah, so you want to watch them and pay attention to them. If they look happy and healthy, then they are more fire resistant. But if they're getting desiccated and they look like they're dried out, then they're not going to be fire resistant. That's the point of the maintenance. But the natives need less water to maintain that moisture content. So they are better at conserving their moisture content, if that makes sense.
Okay. Christy also said that Garrya fremonti, I guess, is amazing. It takes a while to get going, but looks good all year long.
Oh, great. Good.
And Sean said that P. virginiana can get away from you, but it can be part of a hedgerow.
Right.
And Michael asked, did you purposely avoid Mahonia species? Is it not a
You know, I think we'll have a minute here. I have some more pictures at the end. So the cities are not recommending Mahonia or berberis, which is the correct genus now. So that's our Oregon grape. I disagree with that qualification, but I didn't want, and I have some pictures that I'll show you that I took after the Almeda fire. So cities are not recommending them. Some are recommending that if you prune them regularly, I see them as a fire reluctant species. That's not what I've seen in print though. So in a way I avoided it, but if we have time, I'll show you some pictures of why I think that.
Okay, do you have any information on Rhamnus californica? and fire resistant.
Oh, I think that that's a good one. I think that would be a good one. And it might even have soap content. You know, if you look up that, I have a link. I gave the link for that Idaho species where they like really categorize the plants. They talk about the soap content. That might be one of them. But I would think that rhamnus would be good. It's pretty moist. It's pretty moist vegetation and doesn't get really tall.
Okay, Christina thanked you for talking about this issue, and I believe she wrote that when you were talking about the loss of oak habitat.
Okay.
Would somebody else is asking, would that mean that dawn redwood could be similar to larches?
That's an interesting question. Again, I'm seeing in recommendations that they are not recommending sequoias. I'm not sure if that's the giant sequoias. They're just kind of staying away from conifers. The dawn redwoods, you know, you'd want to be sure to clean up the material that they drop in the around this time of year. You don't want that material to build up, you know, but maybe in the spring.
Okay, someone was wondering about madrone as trees as being fire resistant, and then someone right after that said that you might mention that our native madrones and especially manzanitas are very high in volatile oils and very fire prone. So we should avoid having them within 3 feet of the house.
30.
Sorry, within 30 feet of the house.
Yeah. Yes, that is what is thought, having them close to the house, and especially in a clumping, that's not what's recommended. Madrones, though, I haven't heard that. Again, I think it's a part about the maintenance of the plants themselves. So if you think of a madrone, if it doesn't have ladder fuels and it has one stem going up, in that case, I wouldn't see it necessarily burning, but
okay. Also, Christina is offering another native plant list through the xerces.org.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, I don't know if that's on your list, but perhaps you might want to include it when you send out the.
Okay, I'll try to gather that one. Western sword fern is reasonably resistant. And what about native bleeding heart? Bleeding heart would be super, very moisture. I wonder about the Western sword fern. I have read that they are good for fire resistant species. I know that mine accumulate dead leaves and I'm not very good at taking them out, but I do think that they maintain their moisture. I don't know. I haven't read about them. Maybe you can look that up. I did kind of look. It's not in the material that I was looking at, and maybe it's more specific about ferns. I would think that they have a high moisture content, but they can also accumulate dead leaves. So it might be a maintenance issue. Native huckleberries. Yes. So Christina says native huckleberry should be good, a nice shrub for shade against the house. I mean, they're really recommending that what you have 0 to 5 feet is either pebbles or pavers or like annual flowering plants or succulents, not taller things in that close near in spacing of the house. But you know, moist vegetation can also shield your house from radiant heat. Susan Stone, right. So she says, I have many volunteer Ceanothus intergeramus in my yard that are sizable, 3 to 4 feet tall. I don't water them at all. Yes, they're really drought resistant. Are they reasonably fire resistant? I would think that that would be a maintenance issue. The red stem Ceanothus I read did have soap content that made it a good choice. And I'm not sure about the deer brush, the Ceanothus intergeramus wasn't listed, but other Ceanothus are listed. So I would think that that would be a pretty good one, like the California lilac, that version. But again, it's about spacing and placing it with all this vegetation. Madrones proved to be heat shields in the Oak Knoll fire. Yeah. Yeah, I think that the context is really important, and that is what is often not nuanced in the discussion about plants. Even manzanitas, if they are, not right next to your house, and if you've cleaned out the dead material, but that's a maintenance issue. Are you going to do that? And also you wouldn't want a big bunch of them for sure. The drones are very dense and take a lot to start burning. Would you think a lot of manzanita would be the same as long as they are well maintained? Yeah, yes. And I've even seen that written. I mean, generally in our area, people are very against buckbrush, manzanita, madrones, but I have seen it written for other areas that if they are maintained in a landscape context and you take out the dead material, they're not too tight, that then it's not so much of a risk. Madrones, however, shed a lot of leaves, which dry up in the midsummer. Manzanitas burn easily and very hot. Try throwing them on a burn pile. Yeah, they're great wood. It's true. It is the contact with the flame, though, is what they need for the wood. I know I've done experiments with my fireplace where I would stick logs of wood next to my open fireplace before I got a nice insert. And I would see how long it took for those logs to catch with radiant heat. And it takes a while. So things have to be burning. They have to be burning next to your house, which if you have a house next to your house that's burning, everything is going to dry completely and burn, including your manzanitas and your madrones. Any thoughts on native grasses? Oh yes, native grasses. Right. In the information that I was looking at, no one is recommending, irrigated turf is recommended as something that will decrease the fire intensity. And I certainly saw a lot of examples of that in the Almeda fire. Bunch grasses tend not to be recommended. I've seen sheep fescue recommended. Bunch grasses are great habitat, and if they're further away from your house and if there aren't too many, it's probably not a risk, but in general, I think the experts are not recommending it. In an urban setting where neighboring structures like sheds and garages are sometimes closer than large trees and more flammable, it seems incongruous to remove trees that are further than this, but I await my fire department's upcoming wildfire evaluation of my landscape. Michael, that is completely true. And I really agree with that. And I hope that, a friend of mine says, don't punish the plants. That's what I think. If my house burns down, it's going to be because my neighborhood is burning down and all the houses were all 20 feet away from each other. So that's quite a pile, it's going to burn for a lot longer and a lot hotter than any tree. Are they saying soap content? Yes. Soap. Saponins. Yes, it's a chemical component of the vegetation. So some plants have naturally occurring, the chemical is saponins, and that's often like what native people worldwide have used to create soap. It's with that saponins, but plants use it sometimes as, I think as an herbivory deterrent so that things won't eat it. And it also has a depressive effect on flammability. Soap content. It sounds weird. I agree. Any comments about the major cuts of manzanitas in Ashland watershed last year? That does pull down a lot of habitat, but in our normal fire return interval, every 11 years or so, there'd be a fire going through that's clearing out those manzanitas. I think that we have to kind of set things back. It was hard to take in terms of being a lot removed, but I think that for the health of the watershed, it's probably a good thing and they will recover. Yes, soap, saponin molecules. Yes, thanks for the comment on the madrone and the manzanita, Christy. I have 8 to 10 foot mock orange. Don't know what kind, very little scent. ODF said if you don't water them, then take them out of the 30-foot zone. They do need some water. They do need some water. Right. So if you're not going to water your landscape at all, then take them out. But if you're going to water, like I am watering to keep my trees and shrubs alive. So I water probably once to twice a week, depending on what the situation is. But again, you can look at them, and if they look dry, if the leaves are drooping, and that's not a well-maintained plant, it's lost its moisture content, then that's the situation where you would want to move it. That's where it's not that high moisture content vegetation. Let's see. These have been there for many years. What about just pruning them shorter? I'm loath to try to eliminate them. Pruning them is a good idea. That's a great idea. A lot of the species, they recommend cutting them back, and then they grow back with greener, with a higher moisture content vegetation. I know that's the elderberry is one of the ones that they say that about. Is there information on what species survived when Native Americans did more low-level burns? In Madrona manzanita specifically, since they are especially native to our areas. Many of our manzanita species actually need fire for the seeds to germinate. There are, so, you know, and it was a rotating burning that was going on. So in any given area, a fire would come through 11 years. Some of our manzanita species, I think, will live to be about 100 or so. But I think that certainly the early descriptions say that there were still big patches of manzanita chaparral, big patches of buckbrush chaparral in some areas. So it was what we call a mosaic landscape with lots of habitat. And those kind of that diversity of habitat context is what, you know, in some places you have grasslands, in some places you have big areas of chaparral, in some places you have oak woodland. All of those are supporting different species. So certainly there were madrone and manzanita. What I've read is that there were not as many madrones as there are now, that they were kind of kept at a lower level. Maybe the big ones would make it through, and then but there wouldn't be such a kind of brush of madrone that we can sometimes get. That's what I've read. Okay. So let's look at that's the last question I see. It's 7:16. So if you will, oh, I'm still sharing my screen. Okay, so I will now just for a moment. Now this is when they talk about plants and evaluating plants and the lists, a lot of the information is anecdotal. So what I've tried to provide, mostly what I've provided with you comes out of documents that are research. So they've evaluated the plants in one way or another, especially about the moisture content, the soap and mineral content, the plant height, those characteristics that I said for that Idaho document. So now I'm going to share with you some anecdotal evidence. So if you don't mind, we'll go through this pretty quickly here. So the Almeda fire, so I'm in Southwest Oregon. The Almeda fire was a big fire that we had when the whole West was burning in 2020 in September. And this is a screenshot that I grabbed because this area right here is where my husband's house burned down, along with some 2,500 other structures. So we went back and looked at things, and I was really curious to look and see what burned and what didn't burn. The houses, as you can see, and the trailer parks really burned really well. But even here, you can see that there are, along here, it looks like there are some trailers that didn't burn, whereas all of these did burn. So these are Leland cypress. This is why you don't want to plant Leland cypress. They just ignite and flame and burn very thoroughly, generally, not every time, but they burn heroically, as one of my favorite fire professionals says. Now this is across the street. These are Leland cypress. I think this was Scotch pine, which is not very drought resistant, comes from Scotland, and it likes a lot of moisture, often dries in the summertime. And this is an incense cedar. This is a native incense cedar, which they tend not to recommend planting now. But you can see that did not burn while all those others did. It doesn't look terribly happy, but it didn't burn, combust. This is another example. This is my husband's yard. Here's his irrigated green yard, and here's his fence, which he had watered. Over in this corner, this is a back fence. Over here, these are some fruit trees, and this is another incense cedar that was on his neighbor's land. At the corner, there was a pile of incense cedar leaves that burned and burned pretty hot. You can see by that white ash. And here's the incense cedar. It stood right there next to part of the fence burned and all that material burned, and it looks like it got wilted. It wasn't happy, but it didn't ignite. It didn't wick into a flaming fire, this incense cedar. These are anecdotes. This is a house up the street. You can see the house burned down. This is a silver maple. This is a tree that I saw and that we have a lot of next to houses in town. And in the Almeda fire, they did not, right there, it's right next to that burning house, and it did not burn, did not catch and burn. So a lot of times what happens is the house burns the tree rather than the tree burning the house. So this is my husband's house, and this is his neighbor's house, and this is a weeping willow, and you can see it didn't combust thoroughly either. So all around it, things burned down. It got scorched, but it didn't ignite and burn. That's moisture-rich vegetation. Here's a little weeping cherry. So none of these trees are native trees, but these are moisture-rich trees. Little weeping cherry, this car burned, this apartment complex burned on the other. So it had a lot of flame and fire next to it, but this tree on this side, it was kind of scorched, and on the other side, it still looked green, not terribly happy. Down the road from my husband's place, this is another house that was burned, and then there was this square of unburned vegetation. On the inside, this is a silver maple. In the back, these are giant sequoias. I'll show you another picture of giant sequoias. Inside, that's where that silver maple is, all around that green square. This house burned. On the other side of these trees, which are incense cedar and giant sequoia, houses burned. On four sides of that tree and that green square, that green irrigated square, everything burned. In the middle of that silver maple was this tree house that did not burn down. It was completely nestled in this ember screening silver maple. But it was open. Embers could have gotten in there, swirled around, caught things on fire. We walked down the street. These are giant sequoias. I mean, they're not surrounded by things, but the mulch all burned underneath. And you can see that they were exposed to flame. This burned, they were exposed to heat and flame potential, and they didn't just ignite the way you saw those Leland cypresses. This is in town. So all of this mulch burned. This awning, here's an awning, a fabric awning. And this was all native plantings around this building. So if we look at these closely, this is berberis, this is Oregon grape. I'm pretty sure that this is 9-bark. I can't remember at the time. I think that this was huckleberry. So you can see all this mulch burned, and pretty hot here in some places. This was probably chunks of bark mulch. So this all burned. And these plants did not ignite. They got scorched, they got desiccated, but they didn't burn. Here's a picture of a ponderosa pine that was in an area where everything burned. And this is, I think this is my final one. This is Wagner Creek, where it comes down the riparian area. And through here, the fire came through this area, and these went along the ground. You can see it burned, but these are Oregon grapes and alders, and they screened the embers, and this house on the other side did not burn. Oops, whoa. That's a lot of, okay, sorry. That was pictures from another presentation, but this is the picture I wanted to show you. This is Paradise, California. So again, you can see all these houses burned and all these trees. A lot of times the trees didn't burn. Sometimes they did burn, but a lot of these are probably Douglas fir or ponderosa pine, I'm not sure. So that's all anecdotal. and not what you would call research. I didn't compare it. I didn't do controls, but I was walking around and really wanted to see what was burning. So I've shared with you what comes out of the research and a little bit about some of my experience. And I hope that you will use your own judgment, taking into consideration the characteristics of the vegetation and also the maintenance needs of the vegetation. And that is all I have for you. I don't know if there are any final questions. Looks like not. Okay,